Patria o muerte.
Homeland or death. That was Che Guevara speaking at the United Nations General Assembly in 1964. Let's get back to our panel right now. And Bill, in that speech, Che accused the United States, as you pointed out a moment ago, of imperialism, disrespecting Cuba, of racism. To what extent did Che Guevara influence the civil rights movement in the United States?
It wasn't just Che, it was the Cuban Revolution. Absolutely. The Cuban Revolution, probably more than any other revolution at the time, secondarily the Chinese Revolution, had this impact on African Americans, and particularly the more militant wing of the African American movement, because it was Fidel Castro in coming to the United States in 1960, staying in Harlem, meeting with Malcolm X. There was regular outreach to African Americans, and part of this was also the fact that Cuba was grappling with race itself within Cuba. A history that went back to Spanish colonialism and the subsequent years, the influence of the United States. So the Cuban Revolution consciously was addressing the issue of race, not as strongly as they needed to, which Fidel Castro admitted years later. So Che Guevara's speech to the UN was completely consistent with this, and it was another reason that many African Americans looked to the Cuban Revolution with great fondness.
Piero, if we look at what Che did, he tried to replicate that revolution, the Cuban Revolution, on other continents, in Africa, yes, in Congo, in Latin America, in Bolivia, but he failed. Why did he fail then?
Well, because the conditions were not ripe. The Cubans went to Zaire, to the Congo, without knowing what was the situation in the Congo. There is a huge difference between Cuban policy in Africa in the 60s and the 70s. In the 70s, they had learned the lesson of the 60s, and they knew about the countries before they went. They knew about the situation. Che Guevara arrived in the Congo at the head of a group of 120 people without a clear idea of the situation there, and to help a revolution that was collapsing. When one reads the diary of Che Guevara, his experience in the Congo, is a list of suffering because of the situation he finds. And what is striking, and this goes back to what is left of Che Guevara, if you think of the Congo, what is left of Che Guevara is not the success of the operation, which was a failure. What you have through those pages is a man who was selfless, who was totally committed to an ideal, which was a noble ideal, and who was completely honest, and who rejected the slightest privilege for himself.
All right, Ambassador Alzugaray, when we look at Che, there was a biographer who described him as naive, of being a bit of a dreamy idealist. And as Piero pointed out a moment ago, yes, he was an idealist, but he was a noble idealist. What would he make of today's Cuba?
Well, I think there has been an effort to create the new man, he thought, but we have had difficulties in the process. The difficulties stem from our own weaknesses, the weaknesses of the system we created. At some point in time, we started to cooperate very strongly with the Soviet Union. We started to adopt some of the Soviet political methods. And I think we had to pay a price for that. We have, for example, Che was a guy who really knew how to work with cadres and tried to make cadres non-bureaucratic. But our cadres became bureaucratic eventually. And this is a problem that we are dealing with right now. These are problems that do not stem from the fact that Che was wrong, but that we were not sufficiently coherent with the ideas of Che Guevara. And well, it's only normal. In any revolution, there are different points of view, different approaches. So we have had that difficulty. But on the other hand, you must say that in culture and in other aspects of its spiritual life, Cuba has really progressed a lot, especially in health, education, in the arts, in literature. I think we have followed, in that sense, some of what Che thought, because Che, at the same time that he was a strong revolutionary, with very strong ideas. He was a man who wanted to have a strong debate. He was a Democrat in the sense that he wanted to hear other opinions. He was ready to debate other opinions.
Right.
Unfortunately, that was not the way that the Soviets went about it.
Mr. Jiang, what was Che Guevara's legacy in Latin America? I mean, we are looking at him right now, 50 years on, at a time when, as the Guardian newspaper reported, Latin America's left, guerrillas and Democrats alike, are in full retreat.
Well, I would say that it is true that the left wing is declining and the so-called right wing is on the rise. Look at the shining past many years ago. It has disappeared. And now FARC in Colombia is going to become a political party. So everybody in the region has recognized the fact that armed confrontation is not the solution to all kinds of problems. Only political consultation, political dialogue can lead the way to peace. However, everything is different compared with the past, but the root causes of this kind of armed confrontation is still over there. Look at the social problems, look at the income gap in the region. It is still very high. So we need to pay more attention to the future developments of politics in this part of the world. And also, we are not so happy to see that the left wing is declining in the region. As we can see from some parts of the continent, over the past decade, because of the left-wing power or the left-wing governments, because of these kind of social programs like the so-called conditional cash transfer, poor people have been benefiting from this kind of social programs. So I hope that in the near future, no matter the government is on the left side or the right side, should pay more attention to the well-being of these vulnerable people in the continent.
Bill, what was Che's influence in Asia? He did actually visit the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Yes.
He met with Kim Il-sung, who is the grandfather of the current leader of the country. What was that relationship about?
Well, I'm going to answer it in a different way. I think it's more that the impact that Korea had on his thinking, Che's thinking, that he went to a country that had been absolutely devastated by the United States. I mean, at this point in history, there is a willingness to admit that the United States basically knocked down virtually everything that was standing in North Korea. Yet when Che went there, he saw a rebuilt country. And this was something that impressed him. Now, I don't know that he had much in the way of an analysis of the political system, of what was actually going on there, but I do know that he was very impressed that this small country, despite this massive devastation, had been able to rebuild itself, and looked at that as something that the people in the third world needed to consider as they were deciding on their paths to development.
Piero, what about Che's involvement in South Africa in overthrowing apartheid? You've pointed out that the Cubans played an instrumental role. This was in the 70s and 80s, of course, long after Che had died, but his legacy lived on, didn't it?
Yes, but there, what really played a dramatic role was Cuba's military might, and in that case, organized by Raúl Castro above all. The Cubans defeated the South African army in 1975, pushed them back, defeated again the South African...
in Angola, right?
In Angola, yes, and again in 1988. Look, the example of Che, even in Angola, was to inspire Cubans to go and work for the Angolan people. You know, one thinks always about the Cuban soldiers. There was the Cuban technical assistance. There were the doctors who went to Angola for 2 years, the teachers, etc., etc. And then I think there was an influence of Che. of the thought of Che, of the purity of the thought of Che, of the idealism of Che. And this continues, I don't disagree in the least with what Carlos said, but I would add one thing. If you think of one of the great things Fidel Castro did in the last years of his life, La Escuela Latinoamericana de Medicina, the Latin American School of Medicine in the outskirts of Havana, there the Cubans are training cost-free thousands of young people to become doctors from Latin America and some from Africa. And what the Cubans are trying to do is mainly poor people. And the hope is that these doctors, instead of opening offices in the capital and charging a lot of money, will go in the countryside and work for the poor. Right. And this is a continuation, in a way, of the thought of Che Guevara, which represents the most pure of the Cuban Revolution. Because the revolution has to make compromises, makes mistakes, etc. Because of the path he chose, Che Guevara did not have to make compromises.
Right. Ambassador Alzugaray, Che Guevara was killed in 1967 in Bolivia. The United States National Security Advisor at the time, a man called Walt Rostow, thought that his execution was a mistake. In fact, Rostow called it stupid. But Rostow also said that he thought that Che's death would discourage other would-be guerrillas and also showed the soundness of what he called America's preventative medicine. Newsweek magazine has just reported that there still is controversy over the death of Che Guevara and the CIA's involvement in his death. What do you believe happened there?
Well, I think it's a controversial issue. We have the testimony of Mr. Felix Rodriguez, who was a Cuban origin CIA agent who was there and who played a very significant role in his murder. I think there was a debate, of course, inside the Bolivian government and inside the CIA. Should we kill him or should we bring him to trial? I think the CIA, on the one hand, wanted to debrief him. Now, I agree with Piero. Debrief Che Guevara, come on, he would have not given them anything. So probably what they thought was, let's kill him now. Let's kill him right now. And that was basically the same way that the Bolivian government was thinking. The Bolivian government didn't want a public trial of Che Guevara because that would have put into the public eye the corruption of the system, the corruption of what had happened in Bolivia. So I would go with the description that Felix Rodriguez makes. He says that he had ambiguous thoughts, but suddenly the order came to murder him, and that a soldier, Mario Teheran, was given the order and he shot him. I think the description that exists, maybe a little bit, there was some lies there, but it's basically what happened. They decided to kill him because his example, his bring him to trial was not a good idea, and debrief him, as the CIA wanted, would not have worked.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.